Hi, I'm Anatole Herda, and for my first section video over agenda setting and formulation, I'm going to be discussing municipal line of sight restroom design reform. And while this topic might seem super minor, I think it's something that definitely deserves attention in public policy discourse. And so, as we get into this, just a quick outline of everything we'll be talking about. Firstly, I want to give not only background on the policy problem, but just context on why I specifically picked this issue and why I think it's important to discuss in terms of public policy and why it deserves attention. And then moving on from the policy problem, we're going to establish the policy agenda. And then after discussing these sort of elements in lieu of our textbook and lecture recordings and just notes I've kind of taken, we're going to delve into my four policy alternatives, which are some solutions that I've done research into and kind of come up with in terms of line of sight restroom policy and maybe ways we can combat this and actually get this into um, policy reform. And then moving on from there, we're going to do an alternative comparison. So, just certain pros and cons of each of these policy alternatives and potential trade offs they possess, including the elements that I've listed within a table. And then as we move on from there, I'm going to discuss my sort of preferred policy or what I think best um, cures this social issue and then the trade off that it does possess, because no policy can ever essentially be perfect. So, just to jump right in, we have our policy problem. And um, obviously, this is a public issue in terms of direct line of sight into restroom interiors. And so, because of this, it's a major intrusion of privacy, which it then in turn produces safety concerns and many liability concerns. And while this is a primarily public issue, obviously it influences people on a very private level because discomfort in this sort of setting, especially in restrooms in municipalities, which are places people might be required to be for work, transportation, etc. And, we all have to use the restroom. So this is a sort of mandatory prescribed place for people. And so being uncomfortable in these settings is just not as like ideal, and this poses a special threat for vulnerable populations like children, mothers, obviously ADA compliant patrons. And so, as we get into this, sort of the main cause of this issue is how building codes are framed by the International Code Council, because the two main issues they focus on in their agenda are prioritizing fire and ADA accessibility over sightline privacy. So, what we want to do through this policy is set precedent where we don't overshadow those elements, right? But this becomes a primary focus when these new construction builds and these codes do come out, that privacy is treated as an equally important area sector. And so we're going to examine those sort of architectural tendencies and establish the regulatory gaps, because this is something that needs to be brought to attention. And so because the issue is largely structural, um, this issue is not treated uniformly, and therefore sightline protections are something that vary city to city. And this produces very uneven privacy standards for populations. So, just objectives for the policy agenda is first, we want to modernize infrastructure, which will in turn reduce liability, and then set a standard privacy protection. And so that way we can go ahead and set precedent for future building cycles. So, this will sort of focus on risk mitigation and general standardization across municipalities. And then one way we'll want to sort of fund this policy is by integrating it with renovation cycles. So it embodies a sort of incremental reform, which in turn reduces stressors from political figures who might be very budget concerned or acutely aware of their fiscal priorities. And so that way we can more likely get policy on this issue. And then so moving on from there, my 4 policy alternatives, as I sort of thought of the ways to approach this, is one being voluntary guidelines. While this does represent a very flexible reform, it lacks enforcement capability because these municipalities have a decision whether or not they want to enforce this. And so if it's not important or if it doesn't come up on their agenda through local media or ADA litigation, then it's more than likely not going to happen. So then moving on from there, we have code amendments for new construction. And this shows a very incremental sort of reform as previously discussed. And these requirements will be enforced moving forward. So it's a good option. And then we have a more intensive option, which would be phased retrofitting. And this will definitely ensure uniform policy display, but it will majorly produce fiscal strain on communities. And because of this, it's probably going to face a lot of political backlash, especially at a municipal level. And then, so lastly, I think a really fun option is a funding incentive, which uses a budget as leverage instead of a regulatory requirement, which might in turn appeal to an official who might be a little bit scared of regulatory overreach, right? We don't want the government's fingers in everything, and we do want to still keep that local autonomy, but this is a good way to reframe this issue. So, lastly, here's the little alternative comparison, and as we can see, certain ones possess more weak and strong equities due to the cost. It's pretty much directly proportional. And then we do have a few political drawback scales, but of all of these, I really do think that building code amendments are the best way to approach the issue because they're incremental and cost efficient, and this way, our only trade off is the sort of gradual appearance of this policy as opposed to immediate policy uniformity and effect. But yeah, that's it.